Welcome back to Metahumanism podcast, where we investigate the contemporary world at the intersection of metahumanism, metamodernism, and decolonialism with a Ukrainian accent. So today's episode is the second in the series on political philosophy, and more specifically the philosophies of war. Today, last time I did an overall introduction to the field of political philosophy, very schematic overview. And today I will focus more specifically on the typology of violence, and also discuss several influential theories which address violence as not merely as a social aberration, but also from the point of view as a phenomenon in its own right, something that's complex and often even constitutive of a force of nature, of life and order. I think this is an important place to begin understanding the phenomenon of war, and how different thinkers approached it through history. But before we begin with that examination of violence and what it means and why it exists, why do we humans engage in violence, and why is there violence in nature in general, I would like to make this a bit more personal, kind of existential and grounded in reality, if you will, because a philosophical discussion can often get kind of very abstract and theoretical and detached from the realities in a way, losing touch with what happens on the ground in our own lives. Physical violence, more specifically, and war, which is like extreme form of physical violence, in its most direct expression, and they necessarily lead to profound trauma, injuries, and ultimately death. So this is something we cannot forget, and while we're discussing all these things and these basic facts have to be kept in mind, and that's how I approach this topic. And actually, as with most topics within the field of political philosophy in general, war is deeply connected to ethical consideration. I haven't really focused on ethics explicitly on this channel, on this podcast so far, and I will in the future more systematically. But this way of discussing political philosophy, it's sort of maybe an applied way of looking at ethics, because obviously ethics is very important to a practical field, even if it's a philosophy, practical field of philosophy such as politics. So it is my deep conviction that ethics is central to any philosophical investigation, really, not just in political philosophy or talking about war. Whether we talk about art, science, or anything else, war, politics, everything, it's ethical grounding is always important. And but in the field of politics especially, I would say that's one of the central dominant concerns, ethics and how to practice ethically. Politics ethically. In connection to this, I want to revisit one of the rules which I set during my introductory video when I was introducing this channel. I said that there would be no dogmas on this podcast in my discussions and investigations. Unassailable dogmas. And I intend to uphold that rule, because because I believe in it. I think it's important. But critical thinking does not mean or does not in any way preclude ethical commitment. So just wanted to kind of revisit that point and to make that very clear. Having a strong opinion or having an ethical stance is not contradictory to critical thinking. In fact, I would argue that critical thinking, if practiced consistently, leads to more stronger opinions on more subjects. So the difference between blind faith, if you will, or dogmatic conviction, which other people might have in various shapes and forms, regardless of what the content, but just the form of that dogmatic conviction is dogmatic, right? It's based on blind faith or on unjustified or unexamined premises. So critical thinking is different because it implies this persistent courage to question your own opinions and convictions, and to always be ready to adjust them and reconsider them as let's say new information is gained or new knowledge or provide. So basically, provided there is sufficient reason to make the adjustments or to change the opinions and views. So nothing is set in stone, but that doesn't preclude having a strong opinion nevertheless. So there are several reasons also. I just wanted to mention them. I don't believe I mentioned them last time. So why I decided to do this series on the philosophies of war in the first place. Why did I decide to go this direction? Especially after discussing, the Ukrainian philosopher of the heart, Skovoroda, and his inner freedom and inner calling and things like that. High metaphysical and ethical notions like that one. So first of all, I already mentioned Ukraine, the Russian war against Ukraine at the end of every episode, asking you to support Ukraine, and also recorded 2 episodes on that war that continues every day. One was focused on deconstructing the historical imperialist myths of the Russian Empire, and another and the second video focused on debunking some of the propagandist lies spread by Russia since 2014, when they started this war against Ukraine. So that's the first reason. Obviously, it's an important topic on my mind all the time, and this is a sufficient reason to investigate it further. And secondly, and I did investigate it even before starting the series, obviously. And in recent months, I picked up a copy of Karl von Clausewitz's classic work on war, which has an excellent introduction by another scientist or philosopher, Anatol Rapoport, and which I will be referring to in the future episodes, and will go through, which already has shaped my thinking about war in general and what's happening in Ukraine in specifically. Another text, the third reason is another text which I've always kind of also kept in mind when thinking about matters such as this. Sun Tzu's The Art of War, a classic text as well, for many people refer to it. And its influence, it's influential source for anybody who thinks about war seriously and wants to understand it better, strategy and how it works. And so just to highlight the cultural significance of this text, the Sun Tzu's text, is sufficient to remind you about the film Wall Street, which was about as the name points for those who haven't seen it. It's about the Wall Street speculations, especially in the 1980s, and the culture of the Wall Street. And in this text is cited repeatedly in the conversation between the Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas, and then Charlie Sheen's character Bud Fox. So they talk about engaging in financial kind of in economics and in economy and financial system, engaging it as if it were a field of war, right? So it's a metaphorical use of that text, but it's about strategy, right? So so it's connected to how to think strategically. But that's one cultural reference, and then the second one, it's from my own personal experience. Just recently, I went on a road trip to South Dakota, and one of the stops I made in South Dakota was the Cold War era historic site of the Minuteman II. Nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile used to have nuclear warheads, and during the Cold War era it was active and armed and obviously constantly at the readiness to be used should something happen. So that already is a sobering in its own right, just to consider that, mutually mutually assured destruction during the Cold War, and these installations still exist. This particular one obviously is out of use. It's just for visitors to witness and to see and to reflect. But Minuteman III missiles are stationed in other states in America, and this continues. Nuclear armament is still the part of the world, and it's still affects considerations and strategy in politics and geopolitics. So that's the second reason. So this text, the Sun Tzu's text, was quoted at the visitor center of this Minuteman II installation. So that's kind of juxtaposition of ancient Chinese philosophy and mutual and Cold War nuclear standoff. That's kind of sobers you up a little bit if you weren't sober already in terms of your thinking. Fourth reason, during the same road trip, on the tail end of it, as I was returning home to Philadelphia, I stopped by several battlefields from the times of the Civil War in America, namely Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland, which is a site of the bloodiest one-day battle in the Civil War, meaning that I think the battle itself wasn't exactly one day, but the most casualties suffered in one day. That's what this battle is known for. Specifically, and then I also stopped by the Monocacy, also in Maryland, battlefield, and that's it's described sometimes as a battle that saved Washington D.C. Because the Confederate forces were advancing towards Washington, and then they were stopped at this battle site, Monocacy, and they turned around and went back into Virginia, if I remember correctly the details of the they were prevented from going further towards Washington. So kind of a decisive, one of the at least temporarily decisive and significant battles. And then finally in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, it's famous both for the large battle that happened there in the summer of 1863. Also a very bloody and very serious battle, and much more, one could say, much more defining and one of the turning points of the war. And it's also known for the famous Gettysburg Address delivered by Abraham Lincoln later in I believe November, in the fall of that year, at the memorial service for those who perished in that battle. So and it's a huge military, like national historical military park, and you can drive around and stop at different locations because it's a multi-day battle, and it actually happened almost by accident. It wasn't planned or by either side. It's just that Confederate forces were moving, and they didn't expect to meet the resistance and the Union forces at that location, but they did. And then once the decision was made to start the battle, then that there was no going back, and they had to continue until some kind of logical end to this contest and eventually this was one could say it was a victory. The battle was won by the Union forces because they prevented the Confederates from advancing further, and then the Confederates suffered sufficiently significant losses to turn around and again go back into to their territory. So Pennsylvania was kind of saved. There were no, that campaign was stopped, and since then the war continued for another 2 years. But at least there was it's widely regarded as one of the turning points of the war. So it's a very complicated part of history, and obviously the sources of the Civil War go back to the founding of America, slavery, the different cultures of the South and the North, and the system of slavery that was underwrote in a way that the whole economy of the United States from early on. Okay, so all of those four reasons, if you will isolate them, they kind of intersected, and all of them contributed to my decision to explore this direction. I believe in this historical moment, perhaps more than ever. I mean, it's always relevant in some sense, but right now, I think at this juncture, it's extremely relevant and important to understand how to think about war realistically, as dispassionately as possible, but also with an unflinching ethical commitment. And even by saying this, I'm already taking sides in this debate, because, in a manner of speaking, because looking ethically at war, but I mean, this will not prevent me from examining alternative perspectives in a systematic and consistent manner. So with that, let's begin today's discussion, specifically looking at the typology of violence. So violence, it's obviously a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. It extends beyond physical harm, because usually when we think about violence, we think about physical violence, but that's why I wanted to discuss it, and I think it's important to understand that violence is much broader notion than just physical or even, let's say, sexual violence. It's something that involves your body. Yes, those are readily identifiable by anybody who asks, "What's violence?" Physical or sexual violence will most likely come up. But there are other types of violence which are equally as important to understand. Different disciplines of human knowledge, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, critical theory, thought or discuss violence and categorize it in different ways and theorize about it, and so in diverse ways. So this is a summary of different perspectives, kind of a list of various points of view from different disciplines. So what I will do is I will proceed by naming each type of violence, giving its definition, a few examples to illustrate what it means, and discussing some of the most prominent theorists that have made significant contributions to how we understand each type of violence. So first is the most obvious, physical violence. It's direct bodily harm or threat of harm, right? So assault, murder, war, torture, domestic abuse are some of the forms it can take. Some of the thinkers that philosophized or theorized this physical violence was, for example, Thomas Hobbes, a he was a philosopher. He's a pretty significant political philosopher in general. I spoke about him last time. His metaphor of Leviathan for the state, and his justification of the state, absolute monarchy, as a remedy for the state of nature, which he saw as a war of all against all, as sort of this anarchic state where everybody fights everybody. Very kind of dystopian view of human nature. So he saw violence as this natural human condition. That was his view. And so he thought the sovereign power, which was Leviathan, for him is needed to control it. So that's one perspective. Franz Fanon is a post-colonial thinker, a very prominent one. He advocated for, in some of his writings, he actually advocated for revolutionary violence as a necessary response to colonial oppression. So his approach was that, colonization was done violently, a lot of times with genocide-like events, colonization. If you think about native colonization in America or African colonization, imperialist violence was also always prominent. Bloodshed was always part of it. And so to reverse the effects of colonization, he was arguing that it's to be expected that the decolonization might reach a violent stage, and might be necessary sometimes. It may sound controversial, and there's there's debate there to be had and to examine the details. But I'm just providing an overview, so I won't go deeply into it. Perhaps in future I will look into it in more detail for more context. Another thinker relevant here is Michel Foucault. He emphasized how modern power suppresses overt violence in modern societies, developed especially societies, and channels this control into surveillance and discipline. So that was one of the biopolitics is the concept that came out of his work, and it's about how the state uses its power. Sometimes state is theorized in political philosophy as kind of having a monopoly of violence. It's one of the ways to think about what state is. It's some entity, organization on a certain territory that has a monopoly of violence. So that's again, you could deconstruct it and argue about it, but right now it's just an overview. So he talked about how this monopoly of violence is direct channeled into discipline and surveillance, and it's a very relevant perspective for our days, certainly. So second type of violence is sexual violence. So it's any sexual act or attempt to obtain a sexual act through coercion. The most broad definition of it. So examples, obviously, rape, sexual harassment, exploitation, incest, and similar actions. Some of the theorists that prominently discuss this type of violence tended to be, unsurprisingly, feminist theorists, such as, for example, Catherine MacKinnon. They linked sexual violence to systemic patriarchy and gendered power. So looking at the inequalities within power between the genders, between females and males, male being dominant in that hierarchy, and so that's what patriarchy is about. And so the criticism of that system and how violence against women was perpetrated within that system of power. Judith Butler is another prominent theorist. She explored how heteronormative, which means where heterosexuality is a norm, where these, she called it heteronormative regimes, produce vulnerabilities, especially for non-heteronormative people, for queer bodies. So this is related to homosexuality and other gender identities, and how this is again a separate topic, a lot we could discuss in this matter, but this is just for an overview. So sexual violence, second category. Symbolic violence is the third type of violence, and that's the internalized, often invisible forms of coercion that occur through language, norms, and social structures. So examples could be gender roles, class expectations, racial hierarchies, educational systems. So any kind of hierarchies or inequalities which are ossified or kind of maintained through force, which may not be a physical force, but it's not necessarily justified, but it's maintained and by the structure of within society. You know, education, who gets educated, who doesn't, who goes to the elite colleges and who doesn't, and so on. And those are types of and this one of the thinkers, I believe I mentioned him, I'm sure I have it in the early episodes, which when I was discussing philosophy in general. Pierre Bourdieu, he's a pretty influential sociologist, social thinker, theorist, and one of my favorite. Yes, I did discuss it because I discussed different forms of capital. Symbolic capital was one, and he also discussed symbolic violence. So he coined this term, symbolic violence, to describe how social hierarchies reproduce themselves through cultural capital and habitus. Habitus is just your embodiment of your habits of living, and how your certain social knowledge or cultural knowledge that gets transmitted through generations and so on. And another important thinker here is Antonio Gramsci. I also mentioned him in the early introductory episodes. His notion of cultural hegemony, ruling classes that use ideology to gain consent rather than rely just on the force to achieve what they desire. And just to take a step back, violence on force or power in general is all about to effect your will. Somebody wants to do something and wants to overcome resistance to that act, let's say. So that's what power ultimately is about, most generally. So there's physical ways of overpowering others or resistance, and then there are non-physical ways, and so symbolic violence is one of them. Fourth is a related notion of structural violence, and that's systematic ways of in which social structures harm or disadvantage individuals. So the symbolic violence could be also viewed as a type of structural violence, specifically within cultural sphere, let's say, education and so on. But it does deserve a separate category because it's specifically distinct. But so structural violence is related. So, for example, poverty, racism, healthcare inequalities, colonialism, all of these are examples of how structural violence is perpetrated. So it's not necessarily just through physical injuries or threat of injuries or death, but through creating structures that enforce certain rules or certain laws that perpetrate violence or coercion, where people have no choice but to act a certain way. So some of the thinkers here are Johann Gultang. He distinguished between direct, structural, and cultural violence. So there was one specific typology. He distinguishes three different types. In his typology, here we're talking about more than three, but just to provide you an overview, another possible typology, more general or more basic, is direct violence, structural violence, and then cultural violence. Okay, so, and we already discussed some direct would be physical or sexual violence. Structural is what we are talking about now. Cultural is like symbolic violence that we just talked about. So it's related. Paul Farmer is another author and thinker. He's a medical doctor worked with providing services, tuberculosis and other treating in developing societies, and so he analyzed how power works, and he wrote a book called even Pathologies of Power, and how public health, global health systems are dysfunctional often. So so he applied that concept of violence to global health, and he showed how systemic inequality leads to premature death and suffering and mortality and morbidity, in a way, in medical terms, epidemiological terms. Next is cultural violence. This is again related to symbolic violence, and I just mentioned Johann Galtung is again relevant here. So this is somewhat distinct. So the difference is this is about cultural violence is about aspects of culture such as religion, ideology, language, art, used to legitimize or normalize violence. So that's more symbolic violence was more about the way how the differences in education, how that gets transmitted from generation to generation, for example, how these differences, how different hierarchical social structures affect coerce, kind of lead to coercion. And this is even more broader, notion is broader than symbolic violence. Here it's it's structures like on a level of religion, ideology, language, art. It's all society, or even beyond one limited society, that affect human culture, and they legitimize or normalize violence. They may not perpetrate it, but they, let's say, if they romanticize violence or romanticize war, or films that portray violence in an attractive manner, or a non-realistic manner, not deliberately distorting how terrible violence can be. I mean, it's arguable any film portraying violence is already a romanticization or fetishization, but sometimes film may be used well to portray the horrors of war and to reflect at least partially the horrors of what war can be. Obviously, it's an imitation, as all art is, but it can be used ethically. So examples again: religious justification of war. Let's take the current war against Ukraine. The Russian Orthodox Church gives its blessing to everything that Putin's regime does. They actually literally physically go and bless the weapons with holy water. It's a holy war for them. So, and this is throughout history, religion was one of the major reasons for religious misunderstandings or conflicts. It was one of the major reasons for wars and bloodshed and massacres. So it's very deeply relevant, and even to this day. Conflict in Israel, in Middle East, and the notion of global jihad, and the 9/11 in America, all of that has a religious component to it, and it certainly is very relevant and important to understand. So racist caricatures, that's another type of cultural violence. Misogynistic traditions, all of those are examples of cultural violence. So in a way, this is enabling conditions that makes it more acceptable to become violent in a certain way, perhaps. Just a culture that justifies certain type of violence. Sixth form is epistemic violence, and this is related to harm done through the erasure, silencing, or delegitimization of knowledge systems. So this is most directly connected to colonization and imperialism. So colonial imposition of knowledge, of imperialist knowledge, and erasing the indigenous science or language or literature. An example, I will use my history, Ukrainian history. Russian Empire tried to erase the Ukrainian language in the end of 19th century. I talked about this in the previous episodes when I discussed the imperialist myths. There were several attempts to forbid several prohibitions of printed literature in Ukrainian language, and theater, Ukrainian theater, and all kinds of cultural expressions. So, with the intent to erase the culture, and then genocidal. So it's in its nature, it's genocidal, and genocidal policies. You're trying to erase somebody's culture, or deny somebody's culture. It's at bottom, it's whether you call it culturalocide or it's part of the genocidal intent, really. And ultimately, Stalin was the one who actually perpetrated genocide in 1930s. Famine genocide, and then so that's an example of imperialism and colonization trying to erase history, distort history, portray Ukrainian history in a certain way to justify imperialist domination and oppression, and deride or make fun of and disparage the culture of the oppressed, of the colonized, the Ukrainian culture, and remove any resources and try to stop cultural expression. So that's and just thinking about your own history in your own way and formulating your own prevent self-definition, self-determination, self-definition, self-identity. That's all forms of epistemic violence. So some of the important theorists in this tradition are Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. She works at Columbia University. She highlighted famously how colonial power silences the quote-unquote subaltern through epistemic violence. So her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? It's a classic by now in post-colonial theory. Another thinker is Walter Mignolo and other decolonial theorists. So there's a slight distinction between post-colonialism and decolonialism, which I won't go into it right now, but he critiqued the Eurocentric coloniality of knowledge. So in the context of where Western empires used to be, the indigenous knowledge was suppressed, let's say, or replaced by imported knowledge from the imperial metropole and so on. These are just some of the ways of examples and thinkers. There are more to be said, but we have to move on. So number 7 is psychological or emotional violence, and that's harm inflicted on mental or emotional well-being. Examples very common these days: gaslighting, threats, manipulation, verbal abuse, and so on. So this is very often, obviously, these can go together. These can accompany like sexual or physical violence. It's just another form of being violent and expressing your violence. It may not cross physical barrier, but somebody can be psychologically or emotionally violent nevertheless, and this is perhaps even more relevant in terms of like family dynamics, relationships, office politics, and so on. These are more important in some ways, or no less important, this type of violence, and maybe less recognized or less able to be addressed when it doesn't cross certain barriers. It's harder to identify and to counteract, but nevertheless. So some of the thinkers relevant here are obviously may be obvious, but Freudian psychoanalysis and just in generally psychotherapy. Freud emphasized psychic trauma and repression in his theories. Judith Herman is another. She analyzed trauma and stress in domestic and political contexts, and trauma theorists in general Kathy Karath is in one name, but there are many others. They explore trauma perspective in general in psychology, psychotherapy, explore how psychic wounds disrupt time and identity. So you don't have to necessarily be physically violent to hurt. They say words can hurt you, and other people make fun of that. Oh, you're weak. Why are you hurt? Words hurt you. You're snowflake, and any of us can be, and sometimes is guilty of this, and is just part of the dynamic and relations and conflict, which is inherent in human relationships. But it's important to be aware of these things and not justify them and not excuse them when they aren't excusable. Number 8 in the list here is economic violence. So that's restriction of economic opportunity and material resources. Wage theft, exploitation, job discrimination, classism, all of these are forms of economic violence, and it's a valid way to think about this as violence, even though physically someone may not be harmed directly, but structurally, and this is why that distinction matters, structurally the conditions in the economy or in the society may be so the people are forced or coerced to do things they would otherwise not want to do, and that's and unfortunately a lot of people buy into this ideology that where they they actually, though they are not supporting violent, they're not violent, but they support a system that is coercive and violent towards others because they think it's justified, because they believe they've been convinced or they haven't examined it carefully enough. Obviously, some of the thinkers, one of the thinkers is very obvious, Karl Marx. He saw capitalist labor relations as inherently violent through alienation and exploitation. And his analysis in many ways still holds. There were many ways he was wrong, but his sociological criticism still stands in many ways. To a point. David Harvey is another theorist who explored neoliberalism as a model of systemic economic dispossession, and in former relations between former empires and former colonies, there's still inequality of power and inequality of practices, and economics is used as a tool, as a violent tool, really. So that's what this refers to. 9 is cognitive and algorithmic violence. So this is the most, probably one of the newest forms of violence. And that the way to define it is it's harm through manipulation or control of somebody's perception or their data or mental processes. So examples: misinformation, disinformation, slightly different notions, filter bubbles, AI surveillance, predictive policing, and so on, and other forms of algorithmic control. So this obviously very highly relevant. One of the thinkers in this sphere is Byung-Chul Han. He describes the violence of transparency. This is a quote of his term. And another quote, neoliberal psychopolitics. So this is obviously there are a lot of notions which are being developed. This is a cutting edge of philosophy and social theorizing. So, but it's a very important one because it's highly relevant. Another important writer, author, thinker is Shoshana Zuboff. Her Surveillance Capitalism is a well-known book by her. She coined this term to explain how digital systems commodify human experience. kind of turning everything into a commodity, into instrument, of something to trade, to exchange, and kind of alienated from your person or your control, your self-definition, self-identity. Again, some of these themes go through these different types of violence. It's coercion and undermining choice and freedom. Next form is linguistic violence, and the definition here is harm inflicted through speech or language itself. Examples: hate speech, slurs, degrading language. So I mean, it's just it deserves a category of its own, but obviously it would be could be connected to psychological or emotional violence, to cultural violence or symbolic violence. There's common themes here, but more specifically, just the use of language to harm others. Some of the thinkers relevant here are J.L. Austin, as a philosopher of language and speech. Judith Butler, who I already mentioned. So speech acts. This is famous term by Austin. They can do things. So when you say, words are actions in certain contexts. So when you say something and it means, and it actually has an effect, and it's saying something or using language is also an action. It's not just empty, meaningless gesture, right? So so including, it can wound emotionally, psychologically, and which is also tangible, because we humans, we have souls, we have our psyches, and it's an important part of who we are. And when it gets wounded or attacked, even if we are physically unharmed, it's still violence, and it's important to recognize different dimensions. And the notion of performativity is also relevant to this. These theorists, speech acts perform. When you perform, you pay lip service to something, but you're hypocritical, and things like that. Just an example. So performative, like virtue performing, performative virtue or virtue signaling, and so on. Sarah Ahmed is another thinker relevant here. Words they don't only reflect, but also create racialized and gendered social realities. So so it's just the whole idea of using language. When you name something, when you say something, it's also labeling theory in psychology and education. When you label somebody a certain way, they start thinking of themselves that way if you repeat it and if you act towards them. So that is one form of violence. So and it may cause resistance, and it's important to understand the dynamics of relationships in that sense. And finally, we get to the 11th and last in this typology that I'm offering: state and legal violence. And the definition, it's violence enacted or sanctioned by legal or state institutions. And this is important to understand, to highlight that the difference between legality and morality here, because not everything that's legal is moral, and not everything that's moral necessarily is legal. So these are different notions, and we are all aware of that. It's just that this is one example. Police brutality, capital punishment, mass incarceration, just some of the examples. Some of the thinkers are relevant in this sphere is Walter Benjamin, is philosopher from Frankfurt School, differentiated between lawmaking and law-preserving violence. So just to distinguish between the two. Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, the state of exception, he philosophized about that notion. This means that somebody claims exception to the general rules to perpetrate violence. And so as a site of sovereign violence, so the state declares, let's say, state of emergency, and then uses violence because justifying the violence by claiming, let's say, maybe concerns of national security or emergency. Sometimes it may be justified in depending. You have to talk about, give a specific example, which I will examine maybe in the future episodes. Right now, just a general discussion. So, but the whole idea that it's liable to be abused. So laws are suspended and violence is used, coercion or let's say martial law. Let's use a context of Ukraine as one example is, there's martial law in Ukraine. As long as the war continues, for example, it's not possible to conduct re-elections to either the parliament or the president. And so Ukraine has suspended as long as martial law continues, stays in effect, and which means as long as Russia continues attacking Ukraine and it doesn't withdraw its troops from the Ukrainian territory, Ukraine has to defend itself, and it's more there's a greater priority to that than to conducting elections in the midst of violence. So that's just one concrete example, and to relate this to war. And another thinker is Achille Mbembe. His work Necropolitics, and his notion of necropolitics, how states decide who lives and who dies. Basically, that's the term comes from the combination of these roots that mean death and politics, necropolitics, right? So the idea, let's take the example of capital punishment. There are several excellent films on this subject matter just come to mind immediately. But in general, this idea of the state in our times, in modern times, developed quote unquote civilized society, executing people, and we know that it's many times mistakes are made, innocent people get executed, and you can't once you take a life, there is no turning back. If you imprison somebody, you can let them out, harm was done, but at least life continues, and the person can continue with his life, as damaged as it may be due to experience, to the mistake, but that's bad enough. But when you take somebody's life, how can you justify morally that situation? And it's a barbaric practice, and it's again, obviously debates are possible, and but this is my position. That's how I see it. It's a philosophical discussion about crime and punishment, obviously, but there may still, I don't think that in a modern civilized society such a thing as capital punishment should exist. On that note, I finish with the typology. So let me just quickly summarize and quickly go over each of these 11 types again. Just one by one to refresh and summarize. So physical, direct bodily harm, and the theorists were Thomas Hobbes, Franz Fanon, and Michel Foucault. Sexual violence was second, coerced sexual acts. Feminist thinkers such as MacKinnon, or Judith Butler. Symbolic violence, it's a normative cultural coercion. Speaking properly is considered more, you use that, somebody who gets better education and so on, but I already talked about it. So Pierre Bourdieu or Antonio Gramsci. Structural violence, so systemic inequality built into the society. Thinkers here, Gultang on Paul Farmer. Cultural violence, again, Johann Gultang, legitimation of violence, so cultural legitimation of violence, justification, enabling it. And again, just to reiterate, Gultang distinguished between cultural, structural, and direct violence, so in his typology. Epistemic violence connected to colonization and imperialism, knowledge suppression, indigenous especially, knowledge suppression. Thinkers here Spivak and Mignolo. Psychological violence, emotional abuse, in other words, Freud, Karath, Herman, and other thinkers in this, psychological, psychoanalytic, and psychotherapeutic traditions, psychiatry. Economic violence, material deprivation, connected to structural violence, I would say, in most cases. Thinkers relevant here, Marx, Harvey, and others as well. Algorithmic or cognitive violence, it's information control, data control, surveillance, algorithmic manipulation. Thinkers here are Han and Zuboff. Linguistic violence, violent speech acts, often accompany physical violence or sexual violence. Some of the thinkers relevant here are Austin, Butler, and Ahmed. And then finally, 11th and last type of violence is legalized or state violence, institutional force, so police brutality and so on, capital punishment. And thinkers relevant here are Benjamin, Agamben, and Mbembe. This, I think, concludes today's episode. Thank you for being with me. And next time I will continue examining, talking about violence and talking about violence being seen as as not just deviation from or aberration within society, but also as something more complex than that, as violence as part of nature, part of life, part of even order in some ways. These are interesting. It's not in no way meant to justify violence. It's simply a way of looking and understanding why violence exists in the first place. So that's what we'll talk about next time. Please support Ukraine if you're not supporting already. I provide information with every episode. So certainly. If there's any questions, you can always comment and ask. Also, if you can support, just liking, sharing, viewing, subscribing, and any other way, I appreciate. Thank you for being here, and I will talk to you next time.